We have Bob Shrum. He's the gentleman to the upper left side of our screen up there. As I mentioned, he's co-director of the Center for the Political Future. He's also the Warshaw Chair in the Department of Political Science. And that's the Warshaw Chair for Practical Politics in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Professor Shrum has been a political strategist and speechwriter for some of the most influential politicians in history, including Ted Kennedy. He's worked for George McGovern. He worked on the Gore-Lieberman campaign in 2000, the Kerry Edwards campaign, 2004. The list literally goes on and on. So a lot of history there that you'll have a chance to delve into. And then Mike is our other co-director. He's been with us really since the founding, right, Mike? Since the founding of the center. He's worked in over 200 Republican statewide campaigns for politicians, including Jeb Bush, Mitt Romney, our very own Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's worked in 6 presidential campaigns, most recently in 2000 with the late Senator John McCain, as well as many, many others. So I'm going to start, as I always seem to, with Bob, if that's okay, just to give us, the students, a sense of sort of your journey, your path in politics, and how you got to where you're at today.
Good. I'll be happy to do that. And first, I want to say that I'm thrilled to see Mike sitting on the left side. I've been trying to get him on the left side for a long time. I always loved politics. I loved it growing up. When I was 9, I went to the Culver City Democratic headquarters to try to volunteer for Adlai Stevenson. And they talked to me for a while and they said, well, no, you can't go door to door, but we'll let you handle the phone banks or do a phone bank. And so all I had to get used to was people saying, yes, ma'am, because my voice had not changed yet when I would talk. And I was lucky enough that the Democratic Convention was in Los Angeles in 1960. And I was able to volunteer for JFK and work for Pierre Salinger, his press secretary. I spent a lot of time in high school in debate, did that in college again, and was actually pretty successful at it. I was the top debater in the country in 1965. And after Harvard Law School, I was coaching debate, and a friend of mine named Larry Tribe, Lawrence Tribe, whom some of you probably see occasionally on television, said to me, you can't do this for the whole rest of your life. What do you want to do? I said, well, I know what I want to do. I don't know how to do it. So Larry wrote a couple of letters, and I ended up initially being the speechwriter for John Lindsay, the mayor of New York, succeeding someone named Jeff Greenfield, who's been a fellow at the center, and ultimately was George McGovern's speechwriter in the 72 presidential campaign. And then after that, was a fellow at the Kennedy Institute of Politics at Harvard. And in 1976, made the mistake, at least from my perspective, of going to work for Jimmy Carter, who I think he's been a terrific ex-president. I didn't think he'd be a very good president. There's a line from Tacitus about a Roman emperor, all would have thought him fit to rule, if only he never had. I think to some extent that applied to Carter, who helped set up, he's a good human being, I think, but helped set up the Reagan Revolution. I went to work for Ted Kennedy in 1979. He was running for president, was his speechwriter, and then afterwards his press secretary as well. Went out and set up a political consulting firm in 1984, and was lucky. We got clients right away, and ran some. Barbara Mikulski in 1986 was the first Democratic woman ever elected to the Senate on her own. Bob Casey, the father of the current senator from Pennsylvania, got elected governor of Pennsylvania. No one thought he could. And from then on, it was just whole series of Senate races, 30 US senators, I think it's 8 or 9 governors, mayors of every major American city, or virtually every major American city, and international consulting in Ireland, Britain, Israel, Bolivia, and Colombia. And, you know, then the Gore campaign. I did some work for Bill Clinton while he was president, but then the Gore campaign, where I believe that Al Gore was elected but not inaugurated. And then the Kerry Edwards campaign in 2004, after which I went off to teach at New York University and to do a lot of commentating on MSNBC. And I came to USC at USC's invitation in 2014. It was great for me. It was a homecoming. I grew up in Culver City. I used to go to the USC debate tournament when I was at Loyola High School every year, and always intended to move back to California. And then when we were starting the Center for the Political Future, I asked Mike, he was all unsuspecting, to go have dinner at Il Compadre, or lunch, I think it was, Mike, at Il Compadre, Mexican restaurant in Hollywood. And I said, how would you like to be co-director of this? Because one of the great strengths of what we've done, I think, is this is the only institute of politics in the United States that has a bipartisan leadership, a Republican and a Democrat. And Mike and I have often been partisan opponents, but we've never been enemies. We liked and respected each other before, and I would say now that we're even better friends. So that's a long-winded discussion of, the only excuse I have for the long-windedness of the discussion is so far I've lived a long time. Okay, Mike.
Oh, thank you, Bob. Well, as former competitors, I'm going to try to go longer. I was born on a stormy night in Detroit in 1962. No, that was
almost any night in Detroit.
Well, it's underrated town. I don't know if we have any Detroit people there. Yeah, so not a dissimilar story to Bob. I grew up in an Irish Catholic political family. My dad was a night school lawyer, started out on a truck in Jimmy Hoffa's union. My grandfather was an elected, well, I'll say it because in those days it worked pretty well, machine judge. So I grew up around politics, went off to Georgetown University, School of Foreign Service, very interested in international affairs and international politics. We were going to go fight the Cold War. Georgetown requires you in the Foreign Service School to have professional fluency in a language. So I was there at being an idiot freshman in college. I wound up at 8 a.m. 4 days a week being yelled at in Russian by former Major Peter Pirogov of the Soviet Air Force, who one day took a swig of antifreeze, fired up the MiG and landed at Ramstein, threw him the keys and said, I defect. So they got him a job teaching at Georgetown. He was about 6'4", 270, flat top haircut, and he spoke what we would call parade ground Russian, which was he would either yell or scream. But he was a great old guy once you got to know him. And so I was going to go fight the Cold War, but I was also interested in politics. Bob's close friend, Jimmy Carter, was president. And, I took kind of the opposite view. So as a conservative and somebody very interested in foreign policy, it's an interest I've kept up. I've served as a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard for years and stuck around the foreign policy world a little bit on the side. But at Georgetown, I started figuring out I didn't really want to wind up stamping visas in Istanbul. I was running the college Republicans. I tried to get I competed and won an internship at the Reagan White House, but they fired me in my first day because there was a donor's kid. Somebody made a call. They sent me back to Georgetown. And I thought, okay, clearly politics works with some things going on. And if you're the person who gets people elected, you can kind of operate and impact policy that way rather than waiting in line for the next donor's son to jump ahead of you or daughter. So I combined my love of film and theater and storytelling, because I'd always been very interested in that, with politics and started working as an intern, a job I actually held at a political action committee that kind of invented the independent expenditure where they'd run their own ads. And I did that in 1982. It was like a frat house. It was a lot of fun, called NICPAC. And they fired their ad agency for incompetence and being young and ambitious. Anybody here know anything about ads? I said, well, I do. And I knew very little about ads. I'd been an intern briefly at a radio station one summer. So I called up this guy who was an expert producer. It turned out he'd only made one ad, another young guy named Alex Castellanos. And one thing led to another, and we went off and invented advertising out of the back of, rusty Nissan. And, one or two of our hopeless candidates won. My big break was there was a congressman from the Fishtail, Suffolk County of Long Island, who was a Republican machine guy. He was an aluminum siding salesman. And one day the boss there, Tommy Nappel, got all his guys together. Long Island used to have a Republican machine, kind of a rarity in modern politics, and said, all right, any of you guys married and Catholic, stand up. No, Louis, you went to jail. Murray, you're wanted. You're a bookie. All right, what's your name? Bill Carney. All right, you're our fine candidate for Congress. And he got elected in the Reagan landslide. But when he got there, he came out for building the Shrum nuclear power plant on Long Island, because of course the local politics were about pouring concrete, and nuclear power plants need a lot of concrete. So he's running in 1984 for his second term, and he gets a primary, which is unheard of in a machine county. But his Shrum position was so unpopular that he only won by 50 votes, despite being the machine guy in a machine county. So nobody would work for him except this great old Republican consultant named Maxine Fernstraub, who Bob probably knew back in the day. Well, Maxine called me because I had made these commercials and I was still in college. And I said, of course. So we went off and we got him reelected. And I did a bunch of irresponsible commercials because I was young, and they made the horrible mistake of giving me a $600,000 budget. So I said, well, why don't we run radio ads, because we have more money than our erstwhile opponent. You can't do that. There are 48 districts that get New York radio. I go, yeah, including the one we're losing. So we did it. We did the War of the World spot, the music, the cut. This is a test of the Long Island nuclear accident evacuation system. In case of an accident at the Shrum plant, you will have 3 minutes to get to Connecticut. People were having car wrecks. So our opponent, of course, had voted in the legislature to bail out the Long Island Lighting Company, Lilco, because of their Shrum debt, which meant he was for turning Shrum on. And we out-Shrumed them and won. So now my phone's ringing and I'm a political consultant. So one thing led to another. I went to see the great Austin Ranney, a wonderful political science professor, said, I don't know what to do. I'm in my senior year. I haven't been to class in 3 months. I got congressmen calling me. And great old Austin said, you idiot, take a leave of absence and go run some campaigns. There's a lot more needed people here. So I did, and I never went back. So I'm still officially a senior at Georgetown University. And one thing led to another, and I went off and was a media consultant, much like Bob, in the Republican Party. I worked for John McCain and Mitt Romney and Jeb Bush, John Engler, Arnold Schwarzenegger, a ton of governors. Loved doing the television and the messaging. And also corporate work on the side, did it for a long time. And then the party went insane. So I'm still a troublemaker in the anti-Trump world. I'm still a retired general, so I have a lot of friends in the party and they're nice to me. A few of them wish they could be as outspoken as I am. And I still work around public affairs to some extent, but I don't do the Republican candidate stuff because almost all the knife and fork eating conservatives that I helped elect and believed in and fought for 25 years are either cowardly silent or frankly chased out. I have a buddy in Congress who's one of the best people there, great legislator. Joe Biden would tell you that right now if you asked him. And, probably can't win his primary, going to have to retire. So that is a long and winding way that I kind of stumbled into this. And, it's been a couple decades of campaigns and fun around the world. Presidential, dog catcher, mayor, senator, governor, mostly senators and governors, a few members of Congress too. And happy to be here and happy to talk to you guys about how to get started in politics and how it works.
Great, thank you. Thank you both of you. I have one question for each of you, and then I'm going to turn it over to the class for questions. So Bob, I'm going to start with you. We know that President Biden has been taking a beating in the opinion polls, right? His numbers are certainly a lot lower than he would like. And I think one of the suggestions has been, at least one of his real challenges has been inflation. So if you were sitting in a room with President Biden and you had to discuss with him about how he could frame inflation in a way that doesn't blow back on him and doesn't sort of reflect him as we head into the midterms and not too far after the general election, perish the thought, what would your advice be?
Well, the first thing I would say is don't pull a Herbert Hoover. I mean, Hoover went around during the Depression saying, look, there's not a lot I can do. This is a worldwide phenomenon. It's a big problem across the whole world. And the American people basically said, wait a minute, you're the president, you're supposed to fix it. And yeah, this inflation is certainly across the developed world a big problem. And a lot of it is due to supply chain. People don't really understand what supply chain is. So I would say the biggest piece of advice I can give you right now is we need to do everything we can, including being hopeful that inflation begins to abate before the midterms, so that the other economic news, which is pretty good, in fact, it's very good in a lot of ways. We're going to have a bump in December because of Omicron in terms of jobs, so that can take hold. Because what's really going to determine the outcome of the midterms is going to be both where we are with COVID and where we are with inflation. I'd also tell them, look, you need to take the long view here. Yeah, you got to fight like hell in 22. There's a good chance to hold on to the Senate. The House is a very tough proposition, although redistricting worked better in terms of Democratic prospects than people expected, in part because in states like California, in states like New York, Democrats have said, okay, you're gerrymandering, we're going to gerrymander too. And New York is probably going to end up with a congressional delegation of 22 Democrats and 3 Republicans. But you also have to keep your eye on 2024. Ronald Reagan took an incredible shellacking in 1982. Almost every Democrat in sight wanted to run against him in 84. Kennedy declined. He told me at the time, actually, that he thought that Reagan people were mad about the condition of the economy, but they liked Reagan, even if they didn't approve of the job he was doing. And he ended up, because the recession was over by 84, having a landslide victory. In fact, the last year has been the most successful economic year for the US since 1984, except you have this inflation problem. People's wages are going up, but so is inflation. So there's no sense of gain. There's also a lot of fatigue about COVID. So I'd say that he has to announce proactive steps in language that people understand. You can't just say supply chain and think people understand that. It's legislative speak. No one knows what it means. And you have to recognize that you don't have total control over these events.
Mike, is that a similar response with regard to the continuing pandemic? When Joe Biden became president, he was gonna resolve this issue. If only he had a crystal ball and he could look in and see the Greek letter Omicron, right? Do you think ultimately the American people are gonna blame Joe Biden for not resolving the pandemic?
Well, what we've learned about pandemic politics is the elected officials can't win, because your blame for the pain of the pandemic, be it masks people don't want to wear, or jobs they lose, or schools that close, which causes a lot of them to drop out of the workforce because they don't have childcare. And you get very little credit for the positives, what you did. So, COVID in many ways ate President Trump, and in some ways it's eaten Joe Biden. I think he's in trouble politically. The question is, will he still be in trouble after the election cycle? Some of it isn't his fault. I think he's actually done a fairly good job on COVID, though they bungled testing just like the Trump guys did. But he's done other things well, but he gets no credit for it. He also has the traditional off-year problem. In the midterm elections of a new president, generally the country shows a little buyer's remorse and punishes the party of the incumbent president. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that's going to happen again. That's just a cycle of history thing. It's hard to blame Biden for. However, Biden, and I'll say parenthetically, I voted for him. I'm so rabidly anti-Trump, I voted for the first Democrat for president ever, because I think Trump was a criminal. Biden's had a lot of self-inflicted wounds. Biden was elected, which surprised me. Bob and I had a bet. I actually lost. That I didn't think Biden would make it to the nomination because I thought his political skills were wobbly. But he did it, and he did it by running as center left. And once he got elected, he let the legislative agenda veer left. He let some progressives in the House run wild and push him around, making him the old man on the sidelines, not the strong president ruler of his party. And you can debate the Afghanistan pullout, but the optics of it weakened him further. So Biden has been marginalized. Joe Manchin's running the country domestically. And I think Biden, with the Build Back Better plan, swung too big and had something that he had an appetite that he didn't have the votes to do. I think the Democrats made an understandable mistake. They confused a partisan majority with an ideological majority. Joe Manchin's from a state where Joe Biden got less than 30% of the vote. There are limits to what he can do unless he wants to commit political suicide. And I've met very few politicians who run to the idea of committing political suicide. So I think he's going to have a hard time in the midterms. I think he has some time to stage a comeback here. Inflation is definitely a kitchen table issue that's hurting him. The economists debate, and Bob made the case, is this what they call transitory inflation driven by supply chain? And I also agree with Bob, that's Greek. What it really means is if any of you go out and try to buy a used car, you will find out there are very few used cars, so the prices are through the moon. About half the inflationary force in the economy is cars and other goods in shortage. So as the supply chain wakes up, and it is waking up, and starts to work again as COVID recedes, will that pricing pressure and inflation drop or not? Another theory is we're printing money like drunken sailors. The Republicans did it, which as a fiscal conservative disappointed me. They're supposed to not do that. And the Democrats have done even more. Federal government, between COVID and some of the proposed spending bills, is basically trying to spend the same amount of money over the last few years that we spent in real dollars to pay for the Second World War. National debt's exploding. When you print more money, you do devalue it. On the other hand, we have productivity and other things that create wealth balancing it out. So there's a big economic debate. I don't know how it'll turn out, but I know if there's inflation on election day, it'll be very bad for the Democrats. Finally, I would say watch the Senate races. The key fulcrum voters these days are suburbanites, college educated, socially a bit more liberal, find the kookiness in the Republican Party scary, find the neo-socialism and lefty stuff in the Democratic Party scary. Biden won because he got him against Trump. The Republicans won a governor's race in Virginia from behind in a lean Democratic state because they got him back. So the question for the midterms is in those key Senate states like Pennsylvania and Arizona and New Hampshire and others, where will the suburbs go? And it'll be a contest between wanting to punish Joe Biden and worried about the Republicans on the Supreme Court on all kinds of issues. And will Trump succeed in what he will try to do, which is interject him into the debate? And as Mitch McConnell will tell you after a little Kentucky bourbon, that is not good in those places for the Republicans. If Biden can put another 10 points on his favorable, the Dems have a shot at the Senate. I don't think it's over there. If he doesn't, even weak Republican candidates on the cyclical thing could win. And finally, I believe there's a lot of press teeth gnashing about Biden on Putin. I think he's doing a terrific job. And I think he needs to give an address to the country to frame it up, what's going on, because cable media will act like it's World War III and do scare stuff. But if Biden understands what the strategy is, how we're prepared for outcomes, what the consequences for Putin and his gang are, Biden's going to look strong again. And that is the best single tonic he needs to stage a recovery. So, I think Biden has some tools in front of him after 6 months of pretty bad stumbling. And the question is, will he use them and will he have a recovery, or will it be a real Republican midterm? And we just don't know yet. But those Senate races are going to be really important.
Let me ask one last question, and I'll direct it at Bob, and then we'll open it up to the students. And that is, Bob, if the House does go to the Republicans and/or the Senate, we've seen how much Joe Biden's agenda struggled with unified government. Would he be able to get anything accomplished with a divided government?
No, he certainly will not get any major domestic initiatives. There are things like the Electoral College Reform Act, which may pass, and which a lot of Republicans are working on along with Democrats. I don't think it would have support in the House Republican caucus. And in the House, I think Republicans are afraid to break with Trump, who will denounce any attempt to reform the process. But short of something, leaving something like that aside, I think he'd have a lot of trouble in domestic policy. He obviously still have a pretty free hand in foreign policy. And, by 2024, he might have a number of factors working in his favor. COVID might actually be gone. Inflation might actually be gone. And Donald Trump might actually be the Republican nominee again. And there's at least some indication in the polling that Trump would actually be the weakest Republican that could be nominated, that people don't want him back as president, that whatever their misgivings about Biden, they trust him not to take the country in the kind of crazy, destructive direction that Donald Trump did.
Very good. Great comments, both of you. Thank you. All right, I'll be a man of my word. It's time for the class. I'll just sort of work our way around. I'll start with Zane. I'll go to this gentleman over here. So maybe just your name.
Yeah.
And maybe what you're studying, and then direct your question.
Hello, my name is Zane. I'm a freshman studying international relations. My question is more directed towards Bob's response to your second question about Trump being, sort of like the emerging Republican nominee for the 2024 presidential election. As someone who's been in politics like for a long time and seen various presidential races, what is the likelihood that he will be elected, considering that almost 40% of the country believe what happened on January 6th was in fact nationalist and patriotic?
Mike, you want to go first?
Yeah, I had a little, my audio connection warbled a little. So can we repeat the summary of the question to make sure I understood correctly?
What's the likelihood of Trump getting elected again, given that 40% of the country believes that the last election was not legitimate? Is that a fair statement of it?
I'm considering that they believe that what happened on Jan 6th, the Capitol riots, were quote unquote patriotic in a sense.
Yeah, I don't know about 40% say it's patriotic. There is a large number, a troubling number, that doubt the accuracy of the election. Now, I think, frankly, if Al Gore had been the opposite of what he was and been very, very demagogic, which again, thank God he chose not to do, after the Florida recount, I think you would have seen base Democrats go down the same opinion. But we don't know that as hypothetical. The real question is, what about Trump? So there are conflicting indicators. He's clearly the front runner. Should he run? Which I think is an open question. And does he have the strength in the Republican Party that he used to have? Well, he has the presumed strength because politicians are still acting afraid of him. But there's an interesting piece of polling data from NBC News that I've been watching because I've seen it on private polling too. They used to ask a question, is your dear Republican voter, only polling Republican voters, is your allegiance more to Donald Trump or to the Republican Party? Trump used to beat the Republican Party by 20 points with a majority in the 50s. 2 weeks ago, it flipped. And it's now 55% Republican Party, 37% Trump, almost an exact flip, which means 1 out of 5 Republicans have kind of changed their mind. Other polls show when you ask the Republican Party about the future, the Republican tribes kind of break out as follows. About 14 to 15% hate Trump and want somebody else. Not a strong hand, but it exists. Call it 1 out of 7. I'd be one of those people. The largest group of what's left are 30% who love Trump, and 40-ish% that say Trump was great, don't criticize him, but it's time to move on. So there are cracks in the Trump wall, but he's still the wall. And predicting the future will be tricky. One thing that cynical Republican politicians who privately dislike Trump, but publicly put up with him out of both fear and every politician's intoxication with winning, used to say, yeah, Trump's a jerk, but we can control him and he's a winner. He's social media, he's famous, people like him, he brings in new voters. It's a devil's deal, but we got to do it. Now those politicians are saying, where the hell is the Trump that used to be able to win, who should be talking about the price of gas, inflation? Instead, all he wants to do is drool and talk about the election being stolen, which they don't think is the winning move for him, but they know he does whatever he wants. So I think the bigger issue is not the tribal ability to say, oh, the election, they stole the election. Because if you grind on those numbers, they get smaller. Still troubling, but smaller. The big question is Trump's half-life sooner or later than we think? And in the short term, he's still there. Will it be different in 2 years? It might be. The last indicator I point to is some of the potential rivals are not being shy about positioning to run for president. That was unheard of 18 months ago. Governor DeSantis of Florida, others, they smell potential weakness, so they're starting to skulk around a little. That's kind of the poll I'm watching. But the truth is, we don't know yet. But if the election were held today, Trump would be the nominee.
Bob, how about you? Any thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I agree with actually every single thing Mike said.
Bipartisanship.
Which is
And that's
usually not the case. I do believe he is the weakest Republican general election candidate.
Yeah.
That people might. There was one poll, I think it was from Civics, that showed Biden beating him 43 to 33, with 19% saying they were going to look for someone else to vote for. Now, at the end of the day, they probably won't have someone else serious to vote for. But that's the percentage Ross Perot got. I think there's just a lot of, and it depends. And look, he does better in other polls, but even in the other polls where he does better, Biden beats him by a little. I think that given the concerns people have right now about inflation and about COVID, the fact that Biden could beat him by a little or by 10 points tells you that he's a weak candidate. Because if you ask the generic question, do you want to vote for Biden or do you want to vote for a Republican? The Republican wins. So that says to me that Trump has some real disabilities that he would carry into a general election. And we haven't mentioned, by the way, the potential legal troubles that still loom out there.
True.
And that when he gets up at these rallies and says, if I get indicted, let's have the biggest march on Washington in history. I think that scares voters. I think that scares suburban voters. And I think that kind of rally would really scare people. So that's the other thing Mike said. He doesn't know how to act in his own best self-interest.
Right. No, it's true. And we got unelectable Trump now, as opposed to barely electable Trump.
His best worst enemy. Yes, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon. So my name is Raghu Mohika. I'm a freshman studying philosophy, politics, and law. This question is directed more to co-director Murphy. My question is, how is the Republican Party, in terms of their nominees, like say from Goldwater to Trump, and their support, why is it so concentrated among southern states, whereas previously, like in the 60s and 50s, it was predominantly ruled, or they tended to support more Democratic representatives?
Oh, you mean how the parties evolved geographically and ideologically?
Right, like what caused that shift?
Yeah, sure. So part of it was demographic. So to do a capsule history of it, the traditional Republican Party internally had a dynamic between Midwestern interests that were kind of isolationist and East Coast commercial interests, Rockefeller Republicans, that were more kind of mainstream governing. And that fight went back and forth forever. And then with Barry Goldwater from Arizona in '64, the Western and Southern conservatives started getting strength within the party. Meanwhile, the white segregationist Democrats in the South were starting to look at moving to another party as the Democratic Party became, in their point of view, more liberal, particularly on civil rights issues. Ironically, Congressman George H.W. Bush from Houston voted in a way that now would have been criticized by the Republican Party. He was a liberal, as was young Richard Nixon, on civil rights. It was the country club Republicans and the Northern liberals and some of the Midwestern Republicans that were the coalition. But this war became more the Eastern Republican establishment, New England, New York, some Midwest versus West and South, as the South started moving toward the Republican Party. And it came to the head in the 70s and 80s as the Republican Party became more conservative, more Western and Southern, and more populist, while the old traditional East Coast Republicans, the Rockefellers, the Cabot Lodges, and many, many more, were from states that were not only depopulizing as the Sun Belt grew, but were becoming less connected to the conservative, populist Western and Southern values, so stopped getting votes. And we used to have a whole bunch of Yankee Republicans. Now we're down to maybe a hybrid with Sununu in New Hampshire and Larry Hogan. It's been wiped out. On the other hand, we've taken over Democratic Texas and all the deep South states. So there's a good book about this by a guy named Kevin Phillips, who was Nixon's director of demography, written, I think, in '72, which is a study of the realignment of the Republican Party to the South and West from the East and the Midwest. Cultural issues have kept the Republicans in the battle, particularly in the upper Midwest. But it's been a total shift of the center of gravity to the Sun Belt, as we would say.
Yeah, I agree with this. Civil rights, cultural issues. I had a friend who's since actually conceded my point, who said to me, I'm a Rockefeller Republican. I said, well, that means you're a Democrat. And that's what's happened. Today, Ronald Reagan, who was in favor of immigration reform, who actually did a deal with Ted Kennedy to pass immigration reform, including amnesty, and who worked with Tip O'Neill to save and strengthen Social Security, would probably be called a rhino, a Republican in name only, even though people invoke him as a Republican icon.
Great comments. All right, other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Hui. I'm a sophomore poli-sci student. And my question is, given your experience with legislating to win elections, what would you say to Biden to pass this domestic agenda regarding the Build Back Better bill, the Voting Rights Act, the economy, to appease both the liberal and the centrist Democrats and give the best chances to keep Democratic power?
Who do you want to direct that to?
Both.
Both. Okay, we'll start with Bob. Bob, you're back in.
Well, first of all, the old Build Back Better bill is gone. Joe Manchin was asked about it yesterday. He said it was dead. He went to the White House, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, and I'm obviously not aware of all the circumstances, and apparently set forth a bill somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7 that he said he could support. They said, good, let's negotiate some more, at which point he pulled the plug. The right response then would have been to say, on the White House's part, great, we'll take that bill. Now, I think there's some chance, not certain, that there will be some other negotiations and that a stripped down version of Build Back Better may yet pass. But it's not certain. And as Mike pointed out earlier, it's not necessarily in Manchin's interest to help out Joe Biden.
Yeah, I agree with all that on the legislative strategy. I would just say from a messaging point of view, they, beyond the ideological issues of something they didn't have the votes to do, so they kept setting up Biden and he'd lose, weakening him in the bigger narrative, not of issues or anything, but of is the president on top of it. Remember, people voted for Biden for normalcy, not chaos. Now they kind of have chaos from the left and interdemocratic slappy fights inside the Congress. You know, that's all a problem. But the other problem is nobody knows what's in Build Back Better. It sounds like a chain of chiropractors. They should have made it smaller and found 2 or 3 bumper stickers, things people get like childcare will continue next year, and pick fights on those and tried to pass 1 or 2. Not pick a fight and can we get to how many trillion? And so that was a mistake. It got lost in the DC vortex. Nobody understands the squabbling. And what I'm hoping, well, I don't know what I'm hoping anymore as a person without a country politically, but the smart move for Biden this year is to remember it's an election year. Pick the strongest thing he can pass with reconciliation and pass it. And then put the other stuff up, don't get it, and run against the do-nothing Republican Congress. But put it into bumper stickers you can fight over an election year, not the Build Back Better that's something AOC wants. And a bunch of other Dem progressives who live in districts where an anvil can get elected. They're never going to lose. And go save what they like to call the frontline Democrats, which are the 15 Dems in tough seats like Spangberger in Virginia, who are going to get wiped out by this stuff. They're going to lose. And give them something to fight with, which is some slogan things that are smaller and understandable.
Yeah, watch the State of the Union message. See how he positions himself. We'll then find out whether or not he's doing what Mike is suggesting, which is not very far from what I would suggest. I think, for example, he ought to take the law and order issue, and because people are concerned about crime right now, and police reform, and marry them and propose more police, better trained. Now that will anger some people in his own party, to the left of his own party, but they don't represent the political mainstream of either independent voters, swing voters, or the party itself. Look at what happened in Sacramento yesterday. I mean, the Democrats had, or some Democrats had, a bill that would have abolished all private insurance in California and created Medicare for all at a price tag of $340 billion a year. And that may be too low, which would have required major tax increases. And all of these tax increases would have been on the ballot in November. And with a supermajority of almost 75% in the state legislature, in the state assembly, the proponent of the bill didn't even bring it to a vote because it had no chance to pass. So I think you got to recognize what the realities are and operate within those realities and within an electoral framework where you have a chance to win.
So let me just, on a follow-up on that, Bob, then what is Biden's resistance to sort of following what Mike is saying, which is let's get a win out of this and pick 1, 2, or 3 things that are doable? Is he just placating the progressives on the left and seem to be hounding him for not accomplishing their agenda?
No, I actually think he's moved on from that. I think they thought at first that they could get, you know, the Build Back Better bill up to 1.9 or 2. They were never going to get it there. I think they now recognize that. And, you know, and what's the sad thing about this from Biden's perspective is he not only got the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, he got the infrastructure bill that every president's been promising for years and years and years and years. He got it through, but he gets very little credit for it because there's all this focus on Build Back Better, then came Afghanistan, now we have Ukraine, and we have the resumption of the Iran nuclear talks, and all of that has crowded out any sense of success and any capacity to message that success until he gets to the State of the Union, which I think is critical for him this year.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, politics is often comparative. So he does something that's nearly impossible to do, and I will say with some Republican help, and passes a good infrastructure bill. But then he says, for my next trick, I'll levitate an elephant. And that immediately undercut the fact he just levitated 3 angry lions. He gets no credit for that because everybody's saying, all right, let me see the elephant fly, Mandrake. And so then the press, of course, will go and, hey, look at that failure. He can't lift an elephant. What a loser. And everybody forgets that he levitated 3 angry tigers, which was pretty damn good. And nobody's done for 10 years. It's managing what in our business we call the expectation game. And I'd say as a political operative, my biggest criticism of Biden world is they've been terrible at it. The last thing I'd say is he had an opportunity, Clinton style, to triangulate off the progressives a little bit, but he was afraid. And, from his point of view, they probably have a hardcore block of 20 to 24 votes in the House. The Progressive Caucus, a softer count, is 80 plus members. So they didn't want the fight, but the problem is then the progressives grabbed the microphone and started dictating terms. And in the larger narrative of who's in charge, it was very, very bad for him. I think also some of his staff are a little more worried about that vote than they needed to be. So that's where we are. But if he can have a good State of the Union, and he can have some progress on Russia, because he's united NATO, which was fractured before. He's given Putin a very tough situation. Putin has to choose between backing down or a quagmire, and he's starting to choose a diplomatic way out. Biden could have a nice win there that fixes the strength narrative for him and take a victory lap. The other last thing is he ought to do a callback to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which will remind people of it by quickly getting Schumer out of it and McConnell to some extent out of it and passing the Electoral Count Reform Act. It is not the sweeping voting rights thing the Democrats want, but it's really important. We count the electoral votes with a bill written in 1887 where a hot air balloon was amazing technology. There are massive loopholes in it. It is dangerous to have it in place in 2024. And the problem is that the Republicans win the Senate, some hard-headed Trump Republicans may resist it. So it is vital to get passed now with 50 Democrats and 8 or 9 Republicans, which I think will happen. And Biden has said he's for it, but that is a huge fix the sparking fuse box problem in the old wooden house of democracy right now. And if Biden can pull it off and get an agreement, he's done another remarkable bipartisan thing, and he can play that drum even louder, as well as have a very meaningful accomplishment for the country.
I think we have time for one more question. Who's our last question going to be?
Sure. Hi, my name is Nathan. I'm a senior philosophy and politics law student here at USC. And my question is, I guess we could start with Mike Murphy, but both of you, I would like to hear, if possible. How do you think politicians can combat this common distrust of health professionals and the government at large right now that's kind of being pushed by some people in the media?
Yeah.
And you can see it through multiple posts online of people just no longer having any trust whatsoever in politicians, basically.
Yeah, no, it's heartbreaking. Here we are in the most advanced democracy and the most powerful and wealthiest one in the history of humankind. And we found ourselves in a place where we have to offer to pay people to take a miracle drug. You know, a lot of our problems in politics reflect problems in our culture. And I think we have a few too televised reality show stars throwing handbags at each other and not enough science teaching in schools because we got a lot of morons out there. And we have profiteers, as we always have. Some are at a network called Fox that'll tell them what they want to hear and you know, monetize the clicks and the eyeballs. It is a real problem, and I don't have an easy answer for it. The good news about Omicron, the extent there could be, is as a milder variant, with a lower lethality rate. It's spreading quickly, and it's giving people, in effect, a vaccination through a painful week-long flu that still can kill a few of them to help build resistance. So the threat may be declining, but we could have other variants. But you know, it is stunning. It's the anti-science thing in the culture, and there are plenty of Republicans who pander to this, to their shame. What they did with the RNA vaccines, if you follow biotech and science, is really amazing. It is like huge invention of penicillin level scientific breakthrough to do what they did in that speed. It's a miracle of our times. And it's a tragedy of our country and our culture that too many people are so stupid. And the internet is always there as an amplifier of stupidity that, and the people profit from it, be they podcasters or TV quote news networks, that it's killing people. That said, the herd is inching closer to herd mentality, and Omicron, most of the virologists think, has muscled out the far more deadly Delta variant, which is kind of, you know, and for once we caught on the scale of horror here, slightly lucky. But I don't have an easy fix for it, other than martial law. My friends in Singapore tell me that works pretty well.
But Singapore's just been put on the list of countries you can't travel to. Because
right. They'll fix it in a week, though.
Despite all their restrictions, they now have a big COVID problem. The way out of this is to get back to some kind of stable normalcy or normality for a period of time. The country has gone through a lot of trauma in the last 12 years, 13 years, 14 years. The financial crisis, where the recovery was uneven and it left out whole sections of the country. The changing demographics, the story that Trump told that people were losing jobs and income because of immigrants and foreign trade, which isn't true. But if you could get back to a stable prosperity for a while where people were doing better, if COVID gets under control, if the international situation doesn't get worse, but actually gets a little better, then I think you're going to see a different kind of politics slowly begin to emerge. One caveat to that, the cultural hot button issues. I mean, if this Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, that's going to light a conflagration that's also going to have an impact in the midterm elections. It's going to bring out a lot of Republicans, but it's going to bring out a lot of women, and it's going to be a real problem for Republicans in the suburbs.
Yeah, fascinating. All right, we've got about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to offer one final question to you both. Do we think Joe Biden will actually be the nominee for a second term?
I think if Joe Biden is healthy, he'll run for a second term. If the economy is doing well, and if COVID is under control, I think he'll be the nominee. And I think if he gets to run against Trump, he probably gets reelected.
Mike, how about you?
Well, like all presidents, he'll want to run again. If he gets wiped out in the midterms, he might well have primary opposition and be in some trouble if he opts to run again. Right. So I think he'll try, but I think he's in peril now unless he changes his destiny of more political success at the end of this year.
Great. Wonderful comments. I want to thank you both for joining us today. I think the class really enjoyed that. I see we're up against time, so I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to you both. Be well, be safe, and we'll see you soon in person, hopefully.
All right, thank you.
Fight on.
And I finish with a plug. Bob and I do a podcast called The Bully Pulpit, where you can hear more of this stuff. It's used in Guantanamo Bay to break down prisoners. It can get into a lot of detail. And I do another podcast with David Axelrod called Hacks on Tap, where we drink beer and argue about politics.